Okay, here we are, Cheryl Forchuk, round two. Now we had the first one before Christmas, and you were going to have a pretty busy schedule. We said we'd connect in the new year, but Cheryl,
Hmm.
I thought it would be good. I know that you're. I think is it the assistant director of Lawson Research?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
I'm an assistant scientific director of Lawson, which is the research arm of the London Hospital. So, as a subtle clue for that, I put my background there.
And keep going because I know you're a number of other things as well. Can you
Yeah,
just talk
yeah. Well,
about
I
them?
also have I realize I put my tea in my Western mugs, so I guess I'm an equal opportunity promoter. So I'm also a distinguished university professor in the School of Nursing at Western and cross appointed to the Department of Psychiatry. So,
Yeah. Uh,
and with Lawson, I have a research chair at Parkwood Institute Research, which is part of St. Joe's. So that's my usual place I hang out, and that's where my research team works from.
yeah. You're such a resource, Cheryl. I did wonder how you feel because it seems to me that both during COVID and since the worst of it is over, it seems like the subject of homelessness and mental health has risen to entirely new levels, right? And
Oh,
I'm how
absolutely.
that has impacted you and your work. The fact that the public and the media and others are so attentive to that kind of stuff right now, has that affected you much?
Oh, absolutely. Like the one project we're going to be talking about today around our homelessness count study, this certainly has been a big part of it. And when we were doing that project, we were finding so many people. About 16% of the people we talked to actually became homeless during the pandemic. And it's a horrible thing to be homeless at any time. And one of the biggest issues with homelessness is if you talk to anyone with the experience, is figuring out how to navigate the system. Because it's not easy, particularly if you don't have an address, you don't sometimes don't have a phone, there's no place someone can send something to. So just to imagine trying to navigate that system during a pandemic when many of the services went virtual.
Yeah. And how about the communities and media and people like me? I'm sure that you get a lot, you field a lot more of questions from those kind of people
Oh,
now.
well, I
Probably
will
prior.
say we've started, we were going back to the communities in the homeless count study, which I started doing in November. And on this specific issue, since then, you're at the 28th interview right now, not counting the last one we did.
So there is an
So,
interest for sure.
I've been doing my trying to do my bit to bring attention to it, and it's not to just bring attention to my work, but I think we also have to really keep this issue in the limelight and put pressures on various points where we need to see some action.
Yeah. And we're going to cover that a bit later in this, but
Yeah.
I know the last time we talked, you were about ready to head off, do some more work on the homeless count. How did
This,
that
this,
go? What has
yeah,
the
yeah.
result of that?
Yeah, so just background in terms of the homeless count study. So this was funded through the federal government. We had some money through PHAC, Public Health Agency of Canada, as well as Reaching Home to assist with that. And the basic purpose is to try to figure out how many people actually are homeless in Canada,
Yeah.
because the current method really focuses on data from the homeless sector. And not all people who are homeless actually touch the homeless sector. So as a result, we get really serious underestimates
Yeah.
of the extent of the problem. There's two main sources that feed into it. We have a system that a lot of the shelters use, but not everybody uses a shelter. And our point in time counts that, again, not everybody wants to be counted. And not every community has shelters or does point in time camps.
Yeah.
So the current federal estimates that are across the entire country over the course of an entire year, we only have 235,000 people experiencing homelessness.
So that's inadequate. That's not at all
Yeah.
accurate.
And then when you've got those kinds of numbers, that means the resources that come to bear are based on these very inadequate numbers. uh, and which is a problem. The other piece of the problem is because if you have a random error, in other words, like anyone's equally likely to be missed, and say, you're missing 25%, well, you could just add 25% and say that's an adjustment. But the problem is if it's not random, if it's kind of systematic, then you can't do that. So if we know we're systematically missing those smaller communities, which is basically what happens with the current method, you can't simply multiply, because we can't assume that a small rural community would have the same issues as a larger urban one. So anyway, that's the basic thrust of it. And what, as you know, my background is nursing. My PhD was in psychiatric nursing. A lot hospital-based research, as you see from behind me. So with my colleagues, particularly Richard Booth from the School of Nursing, and Lucy Richards, who at the time had been part of ICES, and her PhD is in geography. We looked at, in one of my projects, it was one of our projects around preventing discharge from hospital to homelessness. I was able to put a bit of money in there to see, could we figure out an algorithm or a way of using health data to determine the extent of homelessness? Because we do have like a provincial health data system. We call it ICES. Used to be called ISIS, but nobody wanted to be confused with a terrorist group. Yeah. So now we call them ICES. But we're all in there. It's got the whole province. So you're not skipping over small communities. You could have a community with 100 people. Those people would still be in that database. So we also working with Stephen Huang in Toronto at St. Mike's. We found that he had some data and I had some data. But that was it in terms of people who we knew for sure were homeless or not homeless. And so we were able to develop this algorithm and then see if it actually did it correctly. And it was interesting on a couple of counts. Like one, if someone touched the healthcare system, we could find them that way. Yeah. Not everyone, just as not everyone touches the homeless sector, they don't all touch the health system. But we found almost as many people as in Ontario as the federal numbers would suggest for the country. So we were finding a lot more people experiencing homelessness by using health data than by using homeless data. And again, a part of it really relates to geography, because we could include all the communities. We weren't systematically leaving people out. So when we originally applied to PHAC, it wasn't even the competition had nothing to do with homelessness. It was related to chronic illness and monitoring chronic illness. But we, to keep track of things, have better means of numbers. But we successfully argued that people experiencing homelessness have all kinds of chronic illnesses, and that we don't have good ways of monitoring it. And the idea to take this, which we've developed in Ontario, and then take that across the country. There is a national health data that each of the provinces sends some pieces up to, again, all anonymously. Like it doesn't have people's names or OHIP numbers or anything. But most of the parts of our algorithm actually would exist in that national data as well. And then as well, knowing that we are missing people not touching the healthcare system, to find out what other existing data could we potentially pull in to get more accurate numbers, and to understand the context across the country. So anyway, that was kind of the premise. And we had actually written that proposal pre-pandemic. So you can imagine that kind of complicated things. It was both an advantage and disadvantage. So we kind of had to change a bit of what we were doing. In our original proposal, we said we'd go to 10 communities across the country. PHAC said, what about 12? And of course, no more money, because that's usually how the federal government often works. Like, we'll push it a little bit further. But we said, yeah, okay, we're game. But all those numbers were pre-pandemic. What happened when we started doing that work is we were having all kinds of communities reach out to us, especially smaller communities, um, that were saying, we really want you to come. It's really important to be included. And we knew that those were the kinds of communities that were probably missing from the data. Um, Fortunately, we got further support from PHAC and, as I mentioned, Reaching Home, which serves the homeless, the sector federally. So we actually got to 28 communities across community and across Canada, and we went to every single province and territory. Went to Arctic areas 4 times. We interviewed 400 people experiencing homelessness. In our focus groups, we were just slightly under 200 service providers to understand what the issues were from their perspective. And then what we're doing now, why I've been doing all these interviews, is we're actually going back to those communities to talk to them about what we've learned so far, and just have large forums like we had in London last month. So we invite care providers, we invite people with lived experience, we invite the policy decision makers to have a discussion about the results so far. We still have a year left in funding, so we want to know if there's things we've missed, have some dialogue. And then we're also having some specific discussion about the pandemic. We know the sector has suffered quite a bit, but we're seeing some innovative solutions. So we thought it might be helpful, since we're going to talk about what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, what are unmet needs, just because we're already there, and it would seem a missed opportunity to not have those more in-depth discussions. So it's been quite interesting, because as well as the algorithm, the more mathematical, what we call quantitative, like we're all doing the interviews and going to the communities. It's what we call an ethnography. It's about being there, talking, having conversations, people experiencing homelessness, taking us on tours, essentially, of where, like in one instance, like if you can't get into the shelter, how do you decide which bin is the best bin to sleep in tonight?
Yeah.
Where in the woods would a good how do you decide? How do you manage the toileting in the woods? How do you set up systems? We accompanied many outreach teams, encampment teams, in going across the country. So we really got a really good chance to really see the nature of homelessness across the country. And as I said, like one of the big things is how it's getting worse everywhere. And we found almost everywhere the focus was on, our community seems to be dropping the ball. And really focusing on it on a very local level.
Yeah.
And it's good to have concern locally, but one of the things we're really trying to stress is this is truly a national problem. And although we do need to care about our neighbors and take some action locally, we can't lose sight of the fact that it's national. We know that, in the early 90s, housing was downloaded from the federal level to the provincial level. And then in Ontario, mid 90s down to the municipal level. Canada is really the only industrialized nation in the world that does not have it at the federal level.
Yeah.
And some of this kind of inconsistency across the country and the kind of forced migration it sometimes causes, I think would be much better addressed by pulling it back, like every other country, to the federal level.
So Cheryl, you mentioned at the beginning that it was the federal number 235,000. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
Over the course of an entire year.
That's correct. So what's your assessment now?
We are still working on that piece of it, but I would not be surprised if it ends up 3 times that.
Yeah. You know, when I remember when an MP during the time of the Great Recession. So this is back in
Yeah.
2007. You allocated funds from the federal government, from Ottawa, to cities
Hmm.
on two bases. One was on the basis of the population, and the other was on the basis of kind of an application process that municipalities went through to try and get
Hmm.
stuff. But the population thing was kind of, it was set in place. Your community's
Yeah.
population is this much, therefore you get this. So that made it fairly easy on that aspect of it. But if we didn't, let's say we didn't know what the populations of any of the communities were, then that would make it very hard to administer that program. But that's what you have with the homeless thing, right?
Right.
The
Right. Right.
homelessness, they just don't have an accurate assessment of all the people that
No.
are caught in those positions.
Yeah, and we went some of the communities we visited had as few as 1,000 people,
Hmm.
and we're experiencing during this period homelessness for the first time. And imagine no services at all.
Yeah.
Of course, if you've got 1,000 people and you've never had homelessness, there's no shelter. There's no counting. Some, one of the communities we went to in the Northwest Territories, quite far north, that had 1,000 people. Um, they had just built their first shelter.
Hmm.
And they were saying they were still getting people coming in from even smaller communities that might have 200 or 150 people, because again, like these smaller and more remote areas are not set up, like they simply weren't counted, and the data was an absolute void.
Yeah.
Extremely difficult. But in Southern Ontario as well, we had some communities contact us, similar things, very small populations, not quite similar actually in size. And we're having homelessness for the first time. And one community, the only agency really was a community health center.
Yeah.
There was no homeless shelter. There wasn't even a local Ontario Works office.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd like to talk about the local thing in a bit, but
mhm,
when you say that this is really a national problem, we get that.
mhm,
I think I told you
mhm.
last time we talked that the chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus said that was a number one issue
Yeah,
for all the communities across.
they're big cities, but it's little cities too.
Exactly. So, but when it comes to responsibility for addressing it, I realize government programs, that there's different
Mhm.
jurisdictions, they all share across it. Where does it primarily lie around homelessness?
Well, right now it crosses all sectors,
Right.
right? I mean, that's the problem, because as we were talking about last time, you can't deal with homelessness purely from a housing perspective. It's always about housing, but never only about housing. Income supports and ways of support, because people are, I used last time that analogy of musical chairs, where the chairs represent the available housing within the
It's a good
community.
analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, the people circling representing people experiencing poverty, and the music stopping as the transition points where people become vulnerable.
Yeah.
So when you think of the housing, again, um, things so that we do have that, a national housing strategy that came out shortly before the pandemic, has not been fully implemented. But again, it's based on these lowball numbers
Yeah.
that primarily focuses on the more urban centers. I think the basic gist of that is very good. It focuses on housing first, that housing is a right.
Yeah.
Canada signed on to the UN proclamation, housing is a right. But so some of that, and you got things like CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing, that is federal. But then at the provincial level, it's not just about, for most provinces, having a public housing at that level. Not Ontario. Ontario has it municipally. Um, but it's also the income support programs.
Yeah.
And the kinds of income supports, the kinds of rules that are in place, is really going to impact how many people are homeless, or how easy it would be to get out of homelessness, or not. So that's where you come in. And then in Ontario, the actual public housing as well as things such as shelters, et cetera, has really landed more municipally. So it gets very, very muddy very fast. So again, like we have the example, like in health with the Canada Health Act, where at least there's principles that say everybody's covered across the country. We don't have a similar thing for housing. Canada signed on to this proclamation, but it's the variation across the country is immense, and certainly between the larger communities and smaller communities.
Yeah. So, the City of London has had they're having 3 summits about health and homelessness. And this brings in a lot of different partners. Right? Probably the first time it's happened to that degree. They've had 2 already. And by the time people see this one, they will have had the third, which is near the end of January. So they are doing their dead level best to try to coordinate all the resources that they have within a community. But I think even there, I've talked to many of the participants there. Their feeling is, we can coordinate, we can, collaborate, we can share, we can do all those things best we can. But really, the heavy resources that we need for these kind of things actually lie outside of our own jurisdiction. That's correct, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's why I say that's what we have to.
Yeah.
Like we can do good work locally, but it has to be funded, and some of the principles have to be coming down as well. As I say, like using the analogy of
Health. Yeah.
of health, like we like having principles, I think is really important. And yeah, no, I've talked to participants at those meetings as well, and certainly a number of the projects that I do obviously cross health and as well as homelessness. I mean, we're using health data looking at homelessness. We can see the huge correlation between the two. I mean, one of the things that we did, as imperfect as it was and planned before the pandemic, anyone who's worked in the sector knows that people experiencing homelessness are going to be more vulnerable to any infectious disease. I mean, I've worked in this a long time. You've worked in this in a long time. It seems like every year we get at least 3 major influenza outbreaks. So when COVID, my research team, when we had WSIB thing, was we were supposed to come up with a plan to deal with my staff's greatest risk. I said my staff's greatest risk is and this is like 20 years ago, whatever, is exposure to infection. Because we're constantly in these situations, and I can remember getting some pushback. Oh, are you sure it's not about them being assaulted? No. And 30 years we've had 2 near misses, but we've had TB outbreaks as well as influenza outbreaks. Anyway, there was problems getting the homeless sector prioritized, even though it's clearly congregate living. Their nutritional status in terms of, well, the work you do is compromised. We knew they'd be vulnerable. But we were able to use our algorithm to look at what actually was the risk, and the risk, as we would expect it was huge. There were like 3.5 more times more likely than the housed Ontarian to get COVID.
Yeah.
But also in terms of when you look at the impact on hospital, somebody experiencing homelessness was 20 times more likely to end up hospitalized with COVID than the general population. So to separate out this population and not see not just the implications on health and their personal health, but the healthcare system as a whole. So ignoring this group in any way is misguided, right?
I've been so looking forward to this second installment with you, and here we are. The time's almost up.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just don't know what happened. It's such an interesting field, but if you're good, I would like to follow up again in 2 or 3 months, because I know this is not only an evolving story about the study of it, it's also evolving about the resources that will be coming to it over time. But
yeah,
is it your sense, since you're so much into that sector and looking at it and studying it, is it your sense that we are starting to get our head around it? And then I realize there's also that second challenge. Is it your sense that governments at the various levels will respond appropriately for it? But let's go with the first one for it. I presume you're studying others like it or teaching us a lot, but do you think we get our head around it?
I think in some ways we were like the emphasis on housing first, housing is a right. Like you don't wait till somebody is stable and has their act together and then house them, because that's a very difficult thing to do while you're on the street. Like your planning horizon is like, where's my next meal, where am I staying tonight, who's that walking behind me, and are they going to hurt me? You can't expect someone in that. You have to be in a position of stability to deal with anything, and that itself is not easy. So I think this emphasis on housing first, housing as a right, taking people where they're at, what they want around housing first, having that ingrained in that national health policy is all good. There's tweaks that have to happen because it's never one size fits all. So what that means for youth, for women, for Indigenous peoples, we have to take into account how that may need to be adjusted. But the basic premise of housing as a right,
Yeah.
I think is very good. In London, up until a couple of years before the pandemic, when the real estate started taking off, some of our shelters, we had like 30% vacancy. We were looking at closing the Salvation Army and converting that more into housing. And I'm sure you recall those conversations. But I think despite having better principles and approaches, we've really been hit hard by the real estate market.
Yeah.
First with the price of housing, which is coming down, but it's still the cost of rental.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about people living in poverty, it's not that they're planning on buying a house, it's that they need a rental.
Yeah.
So that is still that's been pushing us back the other way to a large extent.
So the response, Cheryl, do you have some confident measure of confidence? Because you do also speak to those in governing levels of policy.
I will say one of the best thing, yeah, like and I do talk to, yeah, definitely. I even with this project, we're trying to talk to a lot of people in decision making. Because again, we don't blame them for the bad numbers. There's things going on that have made it difficult for them to have accurate numbers. But one of the things I'll just, because we're finishing up, I'll give you a bit of a glimmer of hope there. It really surprised me in a very pleasant way, but a big surprise. Some of the change in community attitudes and going across the country. Like we've had NIMBYism not in my backyard since forever. Yeah. I have started to see more yes in my backyard, more recognizing people as neighbors. We know in London locally, we've seen some grassroots organizations taking that up, but we actually have been seeing this quite a bit across the country, and in different ways. Like in some communities, actually one larger urban center had a Facebook page divvied up neighborhood by neighborhood for people to monitor and bring people things like the clean socks, a blanket, food, but very much a grassroots level, and that type of thing elsewhere. The first time I saw this one thing, I thought, I'll never in my life see this. And it was a community where they were noticing a lot of people in parked cars sleeping overnight. And they decided as a neighborhood to get together, and they would leave a note on the car saying, we notice you're sleeping in your car, as opposed to just calling the police, which is sort of the traditional way of dealing with it. If you need a shower and a cup of coffee, come to this address between, say, 9 to 10. And then they would have other neighbors there in the house. They'd have coffee, etc. And then the next day they would have a different one. When I saw that the first time, I thought, I'm never going to see this again. This is so strange. I found it in 3 communities across the country. Purely grassroots, didn't even know about the other 2 that just spontaneously did this for people they recognized in the community. That's a huge shift in attitude. It says to me, people see their neighbors as neighbors.
Yeah. And now we have to see them as citizens too, with rights and abilities.
Exactly.
Programs and other things that should be designed for them, correct?
Yeah. But to me, that gives hope, because so often in the past, I would see people finding would talk about seeing someone sleeping too close to the house or in a car. And as I say, the first reaction would be, oh, better call the cops. They shouldn't be there.
Cheryl, thank you so much for this. Are you good if we follow up again a couple of months?
Sure.
Because I
Yeah.
think this is an
Love
evolving
talking to you, Glenn.
situation. You'll have more information for us then. Thank you for doing
Yeah, absolutely.
it.
Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.